He pointed a gun at a grieving mother. At her own son's funeral. Officer Derek Vaughn thought his badge gave him the right to humiliate anyone who didn't fit his view of order. When he pressed his weapon against General Elaine Hartwell's temple in front of mourners and cameras, he expected silence, fear, and obedience. He saw a black woman in uniform and assumed submission. But when they picked Elaine, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she was the highest-ranking black woman in Army history, and the mother of a soldier who died uncovering the very conspiracy that Officer Vaughn was a part of. What came next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning that exposed a hidden network of hate embedded deep within America's police and military institutions. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one woman, it's about all of us. Sunlight drifted through the cemetery oaks that morning, casting soft light on a folded flag and a mother's unshakable resolve. And in that quiet, a storm was coming. On a sunlit morning at Arlington Ridge Cemetery, mourners gathered in solemn rows beneath a canopy of oak trees. The air was hushed, save for the distant murmur of taps echoing through the stillness. General Elaine Hartwell, the highest-ranking black woman in Army history, stood in full dress uniform beside her son's casket. Her spine, straight as ever, bore both honor and heartache. Her son, Captain Julian Hartwell, had died in Afghanistan 3 weeks earlier. A leader known for his courage and compassion, Julian had been the pride of his unit and his mother's soul. That day, Elaine was not a general. She was a mother bearing her only child. As the honor guard folded the American flag with ceremonial precision, something shifted. A man stepped forward. He wore the uniform of a city police officer. His name was Officer Derek Vaughn, and his face was tight with fury. "Step away from the flag," he barked, his voice slicing through the reverent silence. Before anyone could react, he drew his sidearm and pressed it against Elaine's temple. Gasps rippled through the crowd, cameras clicked, children cried. Officer Vaughn's voice thundered, "You don't belong here. Not you. Not your kind." For a moment, time froze. Elaine didn't flinch. Her fingers, trembling but steady, reached for the folded flag, the symbol of a life cut short in service to a country that didn't always love him back. Can you imagine such violence at a funeral, such hate in a place meant for peace? And then, a shot. Loud, jarring, final. But it wasn't aimed at Elaine. Someone had fired into the air, setting off a chaos of screams, movement, and panic. Vaughn tackled Elaine, slamming her into the dirt. The flag fell from her hands. The image would haunt a nation, a general, in dress blues, face down in the soil, beside her son's open grave. And yet, in the middle of that pain and humiliation, something began to stir. Not fear, not rage, but resolve. What would you have done, standing in her shoes, with a gun pressed to your head and your child lying in a coffin beside you? Sometimes, injustice arrives, not in shadows, but in broad daylight, with full audience. 3 nights after the funeral, General Elaine Hartwell sat alone in her childhood home. The lights dim, her uniform folded neatly on the armrest beside her. The bruises on her wrists still ached from the handcuffs. The world had seen her humiliation, but only she carried the full weight of what came next. Her daughter, Mia, a sharp young civil rights attorney, entered the room holding a small metal box. This came in the mail. No return address, just marked, "For Mom." Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a USB drive and a note in Julian's unmistakable scrawl. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it back. Trust no one in uniform, except Mom." Elaine plugged the drive into her laptop with trembling hands. Dozens of folders blinked to life. Documents, photos, recorded calls, scanned memos, all detailing a disturbing reality. A secret group embedded in local law enforcement and military channels. They called themselves the Founders. Julian had uncovered a pattern. Black veterans returning home were being harassed, arrested, or discredited. Promising officers were passed over or quietly removed. It wasn't random, it was engineered. And there, face after face, was Officer Derek Vaughn, not just a rogue cop, but a regular attendee of covert meetings, his voice caught on tape, laughing about putting certain soldiers back in their place. Elaine's breath caught. The gun to her head hadn't been an accident. It was a message. How many other families had buried sons without knowing why they were really gone? For a long moment, Elaine sat in silence, watching the flicker of Julian's files. Her grief became something else. He had died fighting an invisible enemy at home, not just the one overseas. The question that rose in her heart was simple and terrifying. Was my son assassinated by the very country he died for? When truth and pain meet face to face, one has to rise. And Elaine Hartwell, mother, soldier, witness, knew exactly which it would be. The following morning, Elaine received a call from Colonel Jameson, a trusted friend from her early days in the service. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "They're coming for you, Elaine. Quietly, but fast. Check your clearance status." Within an hour, her Pentagon access had been suspended. No explanation, no hearing, just a sterile message, pending administrative review. At first, Elaine believed it was retaliation for the incident at the funeral, but Mia, ever vigilant, had already begun connecting dots. "It's not about the funeral anymore," she said, holding up a report from a military contact. "This is about Julian. Someone wanted him gone, and now they want you silent." Julian's deployment to Afghanistan had always felt strange. A sudden reassignment, a risky region, no context. Now, deep in the files he'd left behind, Elaine found communication logs, redacted names, back-channel emails suggesting that Julian's orders had been manipulated by someone with access to high-level deployment authority. One chilling entry stood out, subject becoming problematic, recommendation, reassigned to forward base, limited visibility. Elaine's hands trembled. This wasn't just corruption, it was calculated elimination. Could her son's death have been planned, signed, and sealed by people wearing the same flag she served under? Outside her window, a black SUV idled for hours that night. No one knocked, no one called, but she knew. This was no longer about grief. It was war. A war fought not with bullets, but with reputations, shadows, and silence. She turned to Mia. "They think this will scare me into backing down." "And will it?" Mia asked. Elaine stared at the photo of Julian on the mantel, smiling in uniform. "Would you back down if you knew your child died chasing the truth?" Her answer came not in words, but in the way she stood. Straight, unshaken, ready. It began with a knock. 3 soft taps on the back door of Elaine's home just past midnight. Mia opened it cautiously to find a young man, limping slightly, his police badge clutched tightly in his hand. "My name is Officer Daniel Chin," he said, eyes darting behind him. "Your son trusted me. I have something he wanted you to see." Inside a battered manila envelope were flash drives, voice recordings, and surveillance photos. It was enough to make Elaine's breath catch. Vaughn wasn't working alone. There were meetings, rosters, even coded communications, all leading back to a secretive network buried within law enforcement. They called themselves the Founders Circle, a group sworn to preserve traditional order through intimidation, discrediting, and, when necessary, silent removal. But Chen brought more than evidence. He brought names, allies, officers disgusted by what they'd seen, but too afraid to speak out alone. "We've been collecting everything, but we need someone who can make it matter." Elaine's silence was heavy. She wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. She was the key witness. The truth was a fire in her hands, and it could burn everything she'd built. What would you do if exposing evil meant risking everything you loved? Later that week, she met with Agent Thomas Carter of the FBI. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct. "I've suspected something like this for years, but we've never had a name until now." Together, they formed a fragile alliance, a general, a rogue cop, a young lawyer, and a weary federal agent. Each brought pieces of a shattered system, now laced with corruption. They began preparing their next move, not a protest but a plan, not rage but strategy. Because when the enemy wears your uniform, justice must be dressed in patience and precision. And in the quiet after the storm, Elaine whispered to Mia, "They tried to erase his name. Instead, we'll make sure the world never forgets it." It started with a single video, grainy, shaky, but unmistakable. Officer Vaughn's arm, the drawn weapon, the trembling flag in Elaine's hand, and the crack of a shot meant to incite chaos. Within hours, it had gone viral. By the end of the day, it had been viewed by over 20 million people. Able news anchors spoke her name with solemn reverence. General Elaine Hartwell, hero and victim. Newspapers ran the photo that would become iconic. A black general face down in her son's grave, her Medal of Honor smeared with soil. And America responded. Veterans from every branch of the military stood outside city halls, holding signs that read, "She stood for us, we stand for her." Black mothers lit candles in front of recruitment centers, whispering prayers for sons both lost and living. Even conservative military forums, long reluctant to address race, buzzed with shock and reevaluation. A few tried to twist the narrative. "She provoked it," one pundit claimed. But the truth was louder. Footage, eyewitness accounts, and Chen's mounting evidence painted a picture that couldn't be denied. Then came the call. The president himself, solemn and shaken, offered a public apology in a nationally televised address. What happened to General Hartwell is not just a failure of protocol, it's a stain on our collective honor. Elaine listened quietly from her living room, Mia holding her hand. Do you remember a time when someone in power finally said what needed to be said? And it didn't erase the pain, but it mattered? That same night, Congress announced hearings into the Founders' Circle. The Pentagon issued a full review of Julian's deployment orders. Elaine's name was trending not as a victim, but as a catalyst. As the sun rose the next morning, thousands gathered at Arlington Ridge, returning to the place where her nightmare began. But this time, it was not for grief, it was for witness. And the country was finally watching. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood. On the charge of conspiracy to commit civil rights violations, we find the defendant, Officer Derek Vaughn, guilty. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Elaine didn't blink. She sat poised in her uniform, not out of pride, but principle. For the first time in over a year, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Vindication. Officer Vaughn was sentenced to life in federal prison without parole. His smirk, once so smug in the face of her grief, was gone, replaced by disbelief. Perhaps he thought the badge would shield him forever. Justice, it seemed, had other plans. But it wasn't just him. Dozens of officers tied to the Founders' Circle were arrested, tried, and convicted. Former Chief Lawson, once thought untouchable, was sentenced to 25 years. The network that had embedded itself in uniforms and courtrooms had been dismantled piece by piece. And yet, Elaine knew this wasn't just about punishment. It was about reckoning. Do you believe justice can ever be enough to heal a wound that deep? At Arlington Ridge, a new ceremony took place. Julian's funeral, this time without interruption. As taps played once more, Elaine received the folded flag with steady hands, her face a canvas of sorrow and strength. This time, no guns were drawn, only salutes. Later that day, Congress passed the Julian Hartwell Military Protection Act, establishing federal oversight for cases involving racial bias against service members. It was Julian's legacy codified into law. In her speech, Elaine said simply, "This was never about revenge. It was about remembering who we say we are and demanding we live up to it." She paused, eyes scanning the faces before her. How many more sons must be lost before we say never again and mean it? And for the first time in a long while, the silence that followed did not feel hollow. It felt like change. 1 year after that first shattered funeral, the gates of Arlington Ridge Cemetery opened again, not for sorrow, but for tribute. Hundreds gathered under the quiet hush of a spring morning as sunlight shimmered across rows of headstones. In the center stood a new monument, the Hartwell Memorial for Justice and Service. General Elaine Hartwell stood before it, her shoulders bearing 4 stars now, the first black woman in American history to achieve such rank. Her promotion, once delayed under shadow, had come not as compensation, but recognition earned under fire. Behind her stood Mia, Officer Daniel Chen, Agent Carter, and members of Julian's unit, all of them part of the coalition that had turned a personal tragedy into national reform. Beside them stood young cadets, inspired by Julian's sacrifice, their futures shaped by the law his name had created. Elaine stepped forward, her voice steady but full. "My son was never meant to be forgotten. He was meant to be followed." She placed her hand on the cool stone. Julian's name, etched deeply, caught the light. Across the country, changes rippled outward. Police academies now taught ethics modules based on the Hartwell protocols. Military justice systems included new protections for whistleblowers and minority officers. A fund bearing Julian's name offered legal support to veterans facing discrimination. But beyond the policies, something deeper had shifted. Communities, especially older ones, had found new ways to talk about truth. Grandparents told their grandchildren not just what happened, but what should never happen again. And Elaine? She still visited the grave every week, placing a single white rose and whispering, "We did it, son." Would you have believed after everything that one mother's courage could rewrite the rules of power? As the ceremony ended, a young black cadet approached Elaine. "General," she said softly, "I'm here because of you." Elaine smiled, a quiet pride in her eyes. Legacy, she had learned, isn't what you leave behind. It's who stands taller because you endured. Sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is simply stand their ground with grace. General Elaine Hartwell didn't raise her voice, didn't strike back. She held her head high while the world tried to bury her with shame. And in doing so, she revealed a truth many hoped would stay hidden. Her courage wasn't loud, it was steady. It was the kind of quiet strength many of us have carried through losses, through prejudice, through the long wait for fairness that sometimes never seems to come. But here's the lesson her story leaves us with. We are never too old, too small, or too late to make a difference. Standing up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means refusing to look away, refusing to be broken, and passing on that dignity to the next generation. So, if you've ever wondered whether your quiet persistence matters, know that it does. Justice may take time, but it remembers those who stood tall when the world expected them to fall. Beneath the quiet canopy of trees at Arlington Ridge, General Elaine Hartwell laid a single white rose on her son's grave. There were no crowds, no cameras. Only the hush of morning and the whisper of wind through the leaves. It was a moment of quiet power, not born from victory but from survival, from knowing she had stood through fire and still chosen to walk forward with dignity. The path ahead was not about revenge, but rebuilding. Laws were changing, institutions were being questioned, and across the country, families who once felt invisible now saw themselves reflected in Elaine's courage. The echoes of injustice hadn't disappeared, but they were no longer unanswered. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. This story, like so many, didn't end in one courtroom or one speech. It lives on, in the choices we make, in the truths we pass on, and in the promise that silence will no longer be the final word. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.